Today on Capechi's Corner, we're starting a new chapter, and the first section is Congruent Figures. Congruent figures are objects that are the same size and same shape. In looking at these triangles, I have triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. So that's this statement right up top here. And if you were to slide triangle ABC on top of triangle DEF, they would fit exactly because they're congruent. So what happens with congruent figures is the angles match up and the sides match up. So for instance, angle A matches up with angle D because they're both listed first in their triangle. So that means angle A is congruent to angle D. We will also say that angle B is congruent to angle E because they're both listed second. The order is definitely important in congruency. And the last set of angles that are congruent is angle C is congruent to angle F. We can say the same thing is true about the sides. So I can say segment AB is congruent to segment DE. They're listed first and second, those letters, in their respective triangles. So that's how I know that those segments match up. I can also say that segment BC is congruent to segment EF. And my last congruency statement is going to be segment AC is congruent to segment DF. So again, the most important thing about congruency statements is the order is definitely important. A major concept in looking at congruent triangles is cpctc. So in looking at the diagram that we have above, we have triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. And we just looked at that similar example, and then we were able to match up some corresponding angles. So we had angle A is congruent to angle D, angle B is congruent to angle E, and we were also able to match up the sides. Segment AB is congruent to segment DE, and the same thing is true for the other two pairs. So if I know that two triangles are congruent, then the corresponding parts of the congruent triangles are congruent. So basically that's what we had done previously. So my corresponding parts is talking about the angles and the sides. So cpctc stands for just that. The C for corresponding, the P for parts, C for congruent, T for triangles, and C for congruent. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Again, meaning that the angles and the sides that match up will be congruent. We have one final example for today. We have triangle FUN is congruent to triangle PAL. So now we're just asking that we complete the given statements at the bottom and match up our corresponding parts. So the first statement says angle U, that's congruent to angle A. Our second statement says segment AL is congruent. We know that's congruent to UN. Now let's just stop right there. A couple things. I can get these congruent statements either by looking at the triangles and realizing what matches up, or just by looking at my congruency statement. So for instance, in number 1, angle U is the second letter listed in that first triangle. So then I'll go to my second letter listed in my second triangle, and I know that's A. So therefore, I know that angle U is congruent to angle A. The same thing is true for number 2. Segment AL is congruent to segment UN. Now I want to point out on this statement as a reminder that congruency statements have segment bars on top when talking about segments. So I will definitely need a segment bar on top of both AL and UN. Now looking at number 3, segment NF is congruent to segment LP. Again, the segment bar has to go on top. And in our final statement, I took the original congruency statement. So I know triangle FUN is congruent to triangle PAL, and that order is important. So number 4, I just rewrote those letters. So I'm stating this triangle is slightly different in order, but again, we're still talking about the same triangle. So I have to be careful how I am matching up the letters. So triangle PLA is congruent. So I'm talking about this lower triangle. And I know that the P matches up with the letter F, so I need to list that first. I know the L matches up with letter N, so I need to match that up and make sure I write that second. And the last letter, letter A, matches up with the letter U. So I'm going to say triangle PLA is congruent to triangle FNU.